Hi everyone, in this video we're going to continue to talk about the different early Neolithic societies. And so one of the earliest groups that we're going to look at is the Natufians. The Natufians lived in Syria and Palestine from about 12,000 to about 8,000 BC. They hunted local antelope and cultivated local cereal crops like maize and barley, and they developed permanent villages of about 150 people. And so this is kind of the hallmark of the Neolithic Revolution, this ability to create permanent settlements. So these permanent villages, still pretty small, just sustaining about 150 people. And they also developed more sophisticated tools, sickles, plows, stone bowls, and axes. And so here we see growing sophistication that is going to make permanent settlements and larger settlements more feasible. One of these larger settlements is the city of Jericho. Now, this is famous city because it's referenced in the Bible. And so we find the city of Jericho established in 9,000. It's one of the first places where you have a large number of people living in community. So it's not just a particular tribe, it's not just an extended family group, it's a genuine civic community. And the site of Jericho is still occupied today, 11,000 years later. The spring that fueled the city has never dried up. And so over time, this city grows to about 2,000 residents by about 7,000 BC. So still a really tiny town by modern standards. This is about an eighth of the size of Portales. So you can see how we've moved from settlements of about 150 people. Now we've got a major settlement of about 2,000. Now, if you're following along, you want to move to the next slide. What's important to recognize is that the farming that underpins the Neolithic Revolution is not easy. So human beings have to learn to be able to farm, they have to learn to be able to cultivate their own food if they're going to have these permanent settlements. Otherwise, when the animals migrate away, during a period where crops don't naturally grow, they're going to starve. And so we start to see that in the skeletons from this period, people are kneeling, crouched over for long periods of time, trying to grind their crops into grain. And we see evidence of deformed toes, we see knee, hip, and back injuries and disfigurements. We also see evidence of increased tooth decay from an increased carbohydrate diet. You also have more people living in closer proximity to one another. We all know what that leads to. It leads to disease, especially when you haven't figured out sanitation yet. We find examples such as a settlement in modern-day Jordan, where people even abandoned farming and they returned to living as shepherds, or they returned to living as nomads. Nevertheless, over time, the people, most of the populations, or many of the populations living in the area of the modern Middle East, that's called the Fertile Crescent, you can see a map of this on the slide right now, adopted the practice of living in villages and cultivating their own crops for food. The presence of large bodies of water like the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Nile River were crucial to these farms being successful, and the domestication of animals also helped with tilling and plowing the land for cultivation and as an additional sources of food. And so here we have the Neolithic Revolution. What I tell people is that it's important to remember that the Neolithic Revolution didn't happen because the advantages were obvious to people, or the material advantages were obvious to people. So it's not the case that people adopted the Neolithic Revolution and then were more free, or they had more money, or they lived for longer, or they were healthier. None of these things are actually true. The Neolithic Revolution occurred. People took the courageous decision to try farming and to make the Neolithic Revolution happen so that they could enjoy the camaraderie and the society of living with other people. That's the desire that's driving the creation of civilization. That human beings are not intended to live alone. They flourish best living in community. Human beings are trying to make that community happen. They're willing to make the sacrifices necessary for that community to happen. Now you want to move on to the next slide, if you're following along, that looks at the aftermath of the Neolithic Revolution. After the Neolithic Revolution, we see that individual societies start to become more and more distinct. At first, everyone's just growing grain. What's the difference from this village of 150 people that's growing wheat to this village of 150 people that's growing barley? Not a whole lot. But as these societies become more permanent, they start to create cultural practices, cultural differences that mark them out as distinct. And as people become more stable in these societies, they develop needs, desires for goods that they could not produce themselves. And so here we start to see the development of trade. Once you have oxen and donkey that are domesticated, that means it's possible to transport goods over long distances. With all these rivers, canoes and boats were also used. And so we start to find trade in obsidian, which is a type of glass used to create sharp points. Salt, that was a crucial preservative, the only preservative that these people had access to. They had to preserve crops during periods when there was no harvest. And bitumen, which is a type of petroleum. And this was used as a mortar for proofing boats, as a type of disinfectant, as an insecticide, as a mortar to bind bricks together. So these three tools, or these three goods, pretty important, and the farmers were stable enough that they were able to trade some of their crops with merchants for these goods. And so one of the early Neolithic settlements that we're going to talk about is called Çatalhöyük, that was also in southern Anatolia, so not that far from Göbekli Tepe, established itself as a center of trade. And between 7,000 and 6,000 BC, so you can see how we're moving through the centuries here, it established itself as a city of 5,000 inhabitants. So we're now up to a third of the size of Portales. These inhabitants lived in mud brick houses that had no windows, but had flat roofs. There was very little rain in Çatalhöyük, just as there's very little rain in Portales. And there was a hole in the roof of the house, just a single-story house. That was how you entered. Through the hole, and the roofs were the streets. So no city planning, just all the houses smushed together, no need for windows. So you didn't have to separate them by lots or anything like that. You just got a clump of houses together, and when people want to get around, they get up and walk over the roofs of the houses. So you could just be sitting in your house, and then you hear someone walking over the top of it. Oh, someone's going to get water, or someone's going to the marketplace, or something like this. As we come to the end of the Neolithic age, Neolithic literally means new stones. So the word Neolithic is associated with the creation of more sophisticated stone tools. This age starts to come to an end with the ability to produce metal and the rise of the first copper tools. And so some people refer to this period as the Copper Age. And we start to see the building blocks for this age to come to fruition with the rise of pottery. And so around this time, around 6,000 BC or so, we start to see that these different permanent civilizations are learning how to make pottery. Why is this important? First thing, pottery is really important for historians. Even though you can shatter pottery, you basically can't completely obliterate it. And so pottery will always be there. The different ways that pottery is decorated can reveal cultural differences for historians. So if you're a historian, you're just looking at houses, you're just looking at crops, you're just looking at skeletal remains of animals that people killed, not a whole lot of distinction there. But if you're looking at pottery and the way pottery is being painted, different societies are using different styles, you can kind of start to get a picture, okay, these villages, they have some kind of common background and common identity. These ones are a little bit different. Things like that. So pottery is very important for historians. Pottery is also important because how is pottery made? It's made by heating clay. And so you have to make ovens that are powerful enough to get up enough heat to fire the clay and make the forging of the clay permanent. And so this means that if you have ovens that can heat to this kind of temperature, you also have ovens that can heat copper. And so copper is already being used for jewelry. People are finding copper. It's kind of a pretty thing. But now people are finding that if they put the copper in the heat of the kiln, it becomes flexible and they can use it to bend it into shapes. And so this is another part of the story of the prehistoric Mediterranean. that we find copper being mined in the Balkans, so modern-day Greece, or a little bit further north of modern-day Greece, and the creation of copper ornaments, copper tools. Copper is a pretty flimsy metal, and so the tools weren't that useful, but it's a sign of how industry is developing during this period. And so this is the evolution that we see across the prehistoric Mediterranean. The evolution from human beings as nomads to living in permanent settlements to developing tools and developing trade. And we see how a lot of these changes are driven by religion. Religion is a really important aspect of these societies. A lot of these changes are driven by the innate dignity of human beings and human individuals. They have this ability to problem solve and change the way they live. And so these are the big takeaways. This is a society that predates writing, but nevertheless we see these dramatic changes. And we can tell that this is a deeply religious society, that religion is an important driver of these changes. And we can also tell that these human beings, we have to grant these primitive human beings the dignity of the ability to problem solve, the ability to think rationally, the ability and the courage, because it took a lot of bravery to dramatically change the way they live. And these decisions laid the foundations for the future achievements of the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations that we're going to spend the most time studying during the period of this course. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.